In this portion, Job, in his conclusion, looks back on his former great wealth and the respect that all showed to him. And yet now he looks with misery at his current circumstances and the scorn so many heap upon him. Let's open up the Bible and think on these things. I am Nathan C. Johnson, Bible teacher. I greet you in the faith and fellowship of our great God and Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, whose we are, whom we love, and whom we serve. Let's open our Bibles and turn to the book of Job, chapter 29. And we just saw that Zophar, in his third address, had interrupted Job. He really come up with nothing new except this intellectual, poetic aside to wisdom. Talking about only God knows where wisdom is found. But wisdom is the fear of the Lord and depart from evil, and you didn't have that wisdom, Job. But Job, since Zophar so rudely interrupted, really ignores his argument, and he makes his closing statement and his closing argument corresponding with his introduction about his misery back in Job chapter 3. And so we see Job's conclusion, or at least the start of Job's conclusion, in our study this morning. So in Job chapter 29 and verse 1, moreover, Job continued his parable and said, and a better translation here would be is, and Job again took up his impressive discourse and said. And again, this is Job's last address, his conclusion. And he ignores the interruption of Zophar and gives his concluding argument as he seemed to be sort of leading toward it in his response to Bildad. Once again, I'm going to be reading Job's argument from Bullinger's excellent translation of Job. Chapter 29 and verse 2. Oh, that I were as in the olden times, as in the days when God watched over me. So Job longs, he says, oh, if only things were like they were before. In olden times, before this calamity or disaster, in other words, in the days when Eloah watched over me, the venerable God, the God worthy of worshiping, watched over me. Instead of what he seems to be doing now, tormenting me. Of course, Job thinks this is God doing this torment to him rather than Satan. Verse 3, when shone his lamp so brightly o'er my head, and by his light I could in darkness walk. His former state, he says, it was like Yehovah had taken his lamp and was just shining it brightly over my head. He'd give me the means to walk in darkness. I had been in God's favor. Then remember, that's what Satan accused the Lord of when he stood before him. No wonder Job serves you, because you favor him so much. Of course, that was a little silly. Why did God favor Job? Because Job was so righteous. Because Job was following him. That's why God favored him. Chicken or the egg type of thing. Well, I think the righteousness came first and then God's favor. But Satan accused the Lord, and so that was why the Lord allowed Satan to take it away from him. But Job remembers those days of Yehovah's favor, and he looks back on it and wishes he had it again. The favor of Eloah, the venerable God. Verse 4, as fared I in the springtime of my life, with God's own secret presence in my tent. As fared I in the youth of my life, or in the springtime of my life, is the way Bullinger makes it. But really, the Hebrew reads, in the autumn or the fall of my life. Now we have to understand that in the Bible's climate, our figurative use of seasons does not work. To us, spring, in our very name, shows the part of the world that English was really crafted in. Spring, we call it that because new life is springing up and growing. And fall, the leaves are falling off the trees and new life is dying. But see, to them, winter is the rainy season. And all your wet water crops, those that might get down to 40 degrees at night or something, rather cold, while all your wet water crops, still, they enjoy the wet season. So you plant in the fall. That's the time of planting. The fall, the autumn, is when you plant for the wet water crops. And spring is when you harvest. So of course you would say in the planting season, the season of the early growth of my life would be what we would call the fall, the autumn. And the springtime would actually be the harvest when you're older. So he actually says, in the autumn of my life, meaning in my youth, in my early days. But, of course, that doesn't make any sense to us. That's not what autumn means to us. So Bullinger translated springtime, which is, according to our figurative way of putting things, would be the early part of life. As for I in the springtime of my life with Eloah, again, the venerable God, his secret presence in my tent. So he was secretly there. He was always there. You couldn't see him. But he was always in Job's habitation watching out for him. Verse 5, when Shaddai yet was with me as my stay, and round me were my children in their youth. So he says Shaddai was still with me back then. And I still had all my children. My young children were there, living in my house with me. All was good. Verse 6, when with abundant milk my feet I bathed, and oil from out the rock flowed forth for me. So his wealth was as if he had enough milk to bathe his feet in it. Of course, milk comes from animals, and Job had a vast herd of milk-giving animals. And oil from out the rock flowed forth for me. Oil was very important to them. You'd use it for anointing. It was used for medicine. It was used for covering up smell, because they didn't have the deodorants things we have, so they'd use oil. So these things were wealth. Now, oil from out the rock flowed forth. That is a channel, like an irrigation channel. I had irrigation channels of oil that flowed for me. Well, he says how much oil I was able to have. Verse 7, when to the city's gate I made my way, and in the open place prepared my seat. Now the city gate was where business was done, and this all had to do with their way of life. That the way their way of life would work is that they would gather in the cities at night for protection. The city walls would keep raiders out and so forth. They'd be protected there at night. But since they were an agricultural society, all their farms were outside the city. The little city, the houses clustered together inside the wall. And so every day they would have to leave the city, go out through the city gate, to go out to their lands to work their lands. And then in the evening they'd come back into the city through the city gate. So since everyone had to pass through the city gate at least twice a day, the city gate became the common gathering place. It was where people would meet each other to get business done. If you wanted to meet someone to do some business, you just make sure you got to the gate early before that person could possibly have passed through, and catch them as they come, and then you can do business. And so this got to be the place where the city leaders would meet. They'd meet in the gate, since, again, that was a good place for catching people as they went past. And in the book of Ruth, when Boaz wants to do his business, when he wants to meet the nearer kinsman and try to win Ruth, he meets him in the city gate, and the city leaders are there. So if Job made his way to the city gate and prepared his seat there in the open place at the city gate, well, that means he was among the leaders. He would meet with the leaders, he says. Verse 8, the young men saw me and withdrew themselves. Yea, all the elders would rise up and stand. So when he was coming, the young men would leave. They would hide from respect and awe. Oh, I don't dare talk to Job. He's too much above me. He's too great for me. And the aged. Well, aged, they know to say, oh, there's Job. He's one of us. No. They rise up in respect when Job comes in. And notice Job is describing himself as if he were a king. Who are the young men afraid of and all the elders rise up in respect? Well, a king, of course. Verse 9, the rulers too from talking would refrain and lay their hand for silence on their mouth. So all the rulers in the gate when Job would arrive, they would stop talking. And they would lay their hand on their mouth for silence. Now, I don't know if they literally do that, but it just means they would stop talking when I came. It was like, oh, now that Job is here, our other conversations are not worthy. Or we better start them over so Job can hear them, because we don't want to do the slightest insult to treat Job as if he were just a common person. Verse 10, the noble's voice was hushed. They held their peace, their tongue in silence to their pellet clave. So the nobles, the noble rulers, those high and mighty ones, would be silent when Job came. It would be like their tongues got stuck. My tongue is stuck, I can't talk. Again, this sounds like a king. Who lower than a king could elicit this kind of response from nobility? And this kind of talk in this chapter is what leads some to think that the Job of the book of Job was the Jobab, who was a ruler in Edom, Esau's nation, Edom, meaning red. It was the nation that was descended from Esau. And in the book of Genesis, we have 12 dukes of Edom listed, and I believe the second one is Jobab. And you just add another AB or AV on the end of Job's name, and you get Jobab. And so a lot of people think, well, since he was a king or basically a ruler in Edom, it was probably the same Job. And it could well be. I have no settled teaching who Job was. I showed you at the start of this study that my 3 most respected teachers, each one of them has a different idea as to which Job was the Job. But certainly Job was respected enough to be a king or the leader of a nation, if even the nobles would become tongue-tied when he showed up. Verse 11, the ear that hath heard me blessed me as it heard. The eye that saw me witness bore to me. So all who heard him, who listened to his words, they blessed him. Now, of course, our English word blessing is very nebulous. Who knows what blessing means? I bless you. What does that mean? Who knows? I say something good about you, I guess. Cause some vague good somewhere, or wish some vague good. But see, the Hebrew here, asher, meant, or in this case, it's ashar, it meant happiness. They pronounced me happy. Oh, he's greatly happy, he who can say such words. And he says, the eye that saw me bore witness to me. What did they witness? What did they testify? Verse 12, that I did save the poor when he cried out, the fatherless and him who had no help. So he said, all who saw me then could testify the fact that I rescued the wretched. I didn't leave him in his wretched condition. I rescued him. And the fatherless. And children back then needed a father. Everyone in society, and certainly children more than most, needed to be in some household under a patriarch. And a child who was not part of a household and did not have a patriarch, why, he was in a bad situation. So he says, the fatherless I saved. Anyone who had no help, I saved. Anyone who saw me back then could testify to it. Verse 13, the perishing to me his blessing gave. I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. So the one who was heading for death, about to perish, the Hebrew abad, has to do with perishing and destruction. So that one who was about to be destroyed gave me his blessing. And this is the Hebrew barakah. And barakah, coming from barak, is the word for to speak well of. To speak well of. So the one who was dying spoke well of me, of course, because he rescued him. I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. Again, a widow who had no patriarch, was not under a patriarch, had no patriarch to be under, no family to be a part of. She was in a desperate situation. And yet he would take care of these widows and cause their hearts to sing for joy. Now these were the very things his friends claimed Job did not do. Job, you must not have taken care of the wretched. In fact, you must have oppressed them. Job says, no, anyone who saw me back then could testify that actually I took care of them and caused their hearts to sing for joy. Verse 14, my righteousness I put on as my robe. My justice is my cloak and diadem. So what do you do before you go out in the morning? You put on your clothes. You wouldn't say, you know what, I think I'm not going to put on my clothes today. I'll just leave the house without them. No. No, you always put on your clothes. You never go out without them. So Job says it's the same way. Just like I would never leave the house without my robe on. Naked, I would never leave my house without my righteousness either. Just as I wouldn't leave without putting on a cloak and the diadem that I always wore. Well, so I would always put justice on whenever I would go out. I was never seen in public without righteousness and justice any more than I was never seen in public without clothes. Verse 15, I was instead of eyes unto the blind, and to the lame I was instead of feet. So what about the handicapped? Well, I helped them too. The blind, I was like their eyes. The lame, I was like their feet. I took care of such poor helpless people, Job says. Verse 16, a father was I to the needy ones. The cause I did not know, I search it out. So those who are needy, he says, I was a father to them, an Ab, a daddy to those who are needy. Now Job says, I didn't just take up causes on emotion on the spur of the moment and accidentally jump to the wrong side, because I would search out causes. I would make sure I was doing justice. I wouldn't just hop on board a cause and then find out it was the wrong one. Oops, too late later. Verse 17, I love to break the jaws of evil men and pluck the prey still living from their teeth. So the evil, the wicked, the unrighteous, or unjust ones who would mistreat others, well, I would break their jaws to rescue their prey still living from their teeth, the helpless people that they were harming. Well, that's what I would do to the wicked, to the lawless, to the unjust. He says, not only wasn't I unjust, I would mistreat the unjust. I would rescue their victims. Verse 18, I said, I shall grow old as doth the palm. Yea, multiplied like sand my days shall be. So this is what he said. This is what he thought within himself when he considered his days. He says, because I've been such a good person, I'll grow old like the palm. I'll be like a tree that just goes on and on and on. He multiplied like sand, my days shall be. Unnumberable, uncountable, my days will be because of how righteous I am. Well, of course, that's true for all who rise from the dead. That God gives resurrection life. And if they're in Christ, unnumbered days. Eternity is given to them. So Job thought, I'll surely get that because of my righteousness. Verse 19, my root unto the water shall spread out, and all night long the dew be on my branch. So he symbolizes himself as a tree in an ideal situation. Well watered, its roots find the water, the dew is on its branches. He says, that's what I was like, this tree in an ideal situation. Verse 20, my glory shall remain with me still fresh. My bow within my hand renew its strength. So again, this is what he thought at the time. That his glory, the esteem and honor he was held in, would remain with him still fresh. It would never go stale and people say, oh, Job, he's old stuff, I don't respect him anymore. No, he thought it would always be fresh. And then his bow in his hand, his power, he thought his strength to wield that bow would always be renewed. He'd never lose his strength and his power. Now, glory, remaining fresh, like I said, that's esteem, value, or honor, or what you most esteem about yourself. Well, he thought, I'll never lose this. I'll never lose my strength. Verse 21, to me men hearkened, waited, and gave ear, and at my counsel silence they did keep. So this is the respect that men gave to his wisdom, to his thoughts, the way he judged things. They listened and waited and gave ear to him. Oh, Job is speaking. I want to hear what he says. He's always so wise. And they would keep counsel at his, they would keep silence at his counsel. We would say that he always got the last word. No one could answer again, and Job was so known for wisdom, everyone would say, well, if Job thinks that, must be true. Verse 22, when I had spoken, none replied again, so that on them my wisdom still might fall. So they remained silent after he spoke. They saw the need perhaps to ponder his words and really consider them, since they were so packed with wisdom. Or perhaps they were just hoping that he would speak again so they could have more wisdom. Verse 23, yea, they would wait as men for showers wait, and open wide their mouths as for the rain. So like a farmer is eagerly waiting for rain that his farm needs, well, so these would eagerly wait for the wisdom they needed from Job's mouth. As thirsty people open, or animals, maybe open their mouths wide for the rain, they want the rain. Why, so they were waiting, open-mouthed, ready to receive Job's wisdom. Now in Hebrew, this is the latter rain. That's what it has in the King James Version. And to them, this was the spring rain. Like I said, this was at the end of the growing season. The early rain was in the fall. Then it would rain throughout the winter, the rainy season, and then the latter rain, the last rain, was in the spring. And it was very important. That would rain on the mature crops and ensure that they would come in well. And this is the way it was in Israel. Now, Job wasn't necessarily in Israel. We saw, as we started off, the land of Uz, and nobody knows exactly where Uz is. Perhaps to the east of Israel. But much the same climate there. That the latter rain was in the spring, and they would wait for it. Verse 24, that I should mock them, they would ne'er believe, nor would they cause a shadow on my face. So that I would mock them, they wouldn't believe. In other words, they would always take my word seriously. They would never say, oh, Job, he's such a kidder. He's such a character. Who listens to what he said? No, they always took his word seriously, he says. Nor would they cause a shadow on my face. They would be so careful. I respect Job so much. Oh, I don't want my shadow to pass over Job, because he might not like that. So I better be careful. Verse 25, 'twas mine to choose their way, and sit as chief. As king among his subjects, so I dwelt, and among mourners as a comforter. He says, I chose their way. I commanded people which way to go. And I sat as their chief. Hebrew, that's their head. I was their head. And he seems to say, if he's not saying he's a king, he's like a king. Perhaps like Genesis says, the dukes of Edom, I think it calls them. But they were like kings. And so I sat as chief. Well, remember, Hebrew would often say this. To sit as king would mean that you are the king. If you're sitting as king, you are the king. So when Job says, I sat as chief, it means he was the chief of these people. Now he says, as king among his subjects, so I dwelt. I dwelt as their ruler. And among mourners as a comforter. So he was not a harsh or selfish king, a hard-hearted king caring only about himself. He comforted mourners. He was with all the people. He was a caring and just king. So Job looks back and laments his past. But he also justifies himself here. He says, my actions were flawlessly righteous. And the accusations of his friends are simply not true. And God himself testifies that they weren't true. Remember, he told Satan, there's no one like Job on earth. A man who fears God and eschews, he just rejects evil. And Job insists this. That's how I was. Chapter 30. That's how things were, but he gets to, but now. Verse 1, but now my juniors hold me up to scorn, whose fathers I would have disdained to put on level with the dogs that watch my flock. And notice throughout this portion that Job is speaking of himself, and Bullinger points out his frequent use of I throughout this. And Bullinger says in chapter 29, it is the I of prosperity. In chapter 30, it is the I of adversity. In chapter 31, it is the I of self-righteousness. So Job speaks of himself throughout here, and he says, compare that to chapter 42, after the Lord speaks. When he says to the Lord, I know that thou canst do everything, and I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. A very different I there in chapter 42. Now, Job, as I said, this whole conclusion is self-justification, but we have to remember his friends drove him to this by their just constant pelting him with accusations. So he says, that's how respected I used to be, but now my juniors hold me up to scorn, those younger than I am. Younger in years than he, they scorn him. They look down on him. No, they're fathers. Now, the fathers, being the older ones, are the ones more respected. But he says they're fathers. I would have considered lower than my sheepdogs, and yet now their juniors scorn me. Verse 2, what profit would their strength have been to me when they had lost their ripened manhood's powers? He says these were young men who I consider the only thing these men are good for is for their strength. They can do grunt labor. But that's about it. You know, there's nothing much upstairs. But these young hulking brutes, no advantage to them but their strength, well, now they disdain and despise Job. Those, he said, when their strength perishes, that's the Hebrew abad again, to perish. When their strength perish, they're no good. Well, now they look down on Job as if he's lower than they are. Verse 3, through hunger They were like the barren rock, these vagrants, driven from the land of drought, for ages past to desolation wild. So these men were vagrants. They were like a barren rock, a rock with nothing on it, a rock in a barren land. They were driven from the land of drought, even a land that didn't have much food they were driven from. For ages past the desolation wild, so they were driven into such places, driven to seek food as outcasts from the rest of humanity. Verse 4, who pluck among the bushes bitter herbs, and make the roots of juniper their food. So they were scroungers, scavengers for food. They have to scrounge in the wilderness. Why? Verse 5, from human intercourse they are chased forth, and men cry after them as after thieves. Well, they have to seek whatever food they can find in the wilderness because they're chased from human intercourse. They're cried after like thieves. Now, why would they be cried after like thieves? Well, probably because they are thieves. Or criminals, maybe done something even worse. So they are chased out from among other people. Verse 6, in dark ravines they make their dwelling place, in holes of earth and caverns of the rock. So these who have been chased away, they dwell in dreadful ravines, a place you wouldn't want to go. In holes in the soil, and in caves is where they live. Now there are people who hold with the evolutionary hypothesis, the silly idea that we developed from apes, who think that the first men lived in caves. They were cave dwellers. But that's not the Bible picture at all. The first humans lived in a garden, in an orchard, among trees. And Job's picture is that those who dwell in caves are outcasts. They're actually degenerates. They're not evolving up from apes, they're degenerating down from man. And there's certainly no sign in the Bible that the original men lived in caves. And Job here indicates the cave dwellers are the degenerate. Verse 7, among the desert scrub they raise their shouts, and under bramble bushes herd like beasts. So these wild men, he says, you could hear them in the wild places. Like animals, under the bramble bushes, the hard places to be, that's where they are. Verse 8, children of fools, yea, sons without a name, as outcasts they are driven from the land. So they are sons of Nabal. And Nabal means a fool. And not just mentally deficient, but morally deficient is the fool. And Abigail's husband, remember, his name was Abal, Abigail, that righteous woman whom David married after her husband Nabal's death. He was a fool, and he was, not certainly just in intelligence, but also in morality. So these are sons of fools, these sons without a name, with no good reputation at all. In fact, they're unknown among human society. They have no reputation. As outcasts, they're driven from the land. So out of the land, they're chased because of the kind of people they are. Verse 9, but now I have become their mocking song. I have become a byword unto them. So now these people no one else can stand, these degenerates chased off from human society. Now these are making fun of Job. They're looking down on him as if they're superior. It's like they're saying, ha, 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 I might have it bad, but at least I'm not as bad off as Job. At least we're better off than Job is. At least we're higher up than he is. You can't get lower. You'd think you couldn't get lower than us, but then look at Job. Verse 10, they all abhor and stand aloof from me, and spare not now to spit before my face. So these outcasts, avoided by all others, avoid Job like an outcast. Instead of respecting someone like them would respect a great man like Job like he used to be, well, now they spit before his face in contempt. Even the lowest of the low have no respect for me, Job says. Verse 11, since he hath loosed my bow and humbled me, they too before me cast off all restraint. So God has loosed his bow. Remember back in 29:20, he said, my bow within my hand, renew its strength. He thought I'd always have my strength. But he says, now, he, that is God, has loosed my bow and humbled me. Well, of course, he's thinking it's God who's done it. Job still has no concept that Satan is the one who really did this to him. But he says, since God did this to me and loosed my bow, well, now even these degenerate outcasts cast off our restraint. This rabble feels safe in my presence to humble me because God humbled me first. Verse 12, at my right hand this rabble rises up. They thrust aside my feet, leave me no room. Against me they oppose their hostile ways. So this rabble are on his right hand, his position where you'd expect his right-hand man, his prime minister, his helper. Now this rabble is on his right hand. They thrust aside my feet, they leave me no room. They say, get out of here, Job. This is our place now. This rabble who had no place, these outcasts, thrust him out as an outcast. Against me they oppose their hostile ways. They're freely hostile to me, whereas before they certainly would not have dared. Wouldn't have dared to oppose anyone. They were such outcasts, not to mention a mighty man like Job. Verse 13, they mar my path, my movements they impede. They seek my hurt, although it helps them not. So they mar my path, they get in my way. If I'm trying to walk, they stand in my path. Job, you better move. I'm not going to move aside for you, you just better move aside for me. I'm the big man here, Job. You're just the scum of the earth. And he says, even though they get no good out of it, they seek ill for me. They just think it's fun. They just think it's funny. Oh, this once mighty man Job. It's fun to seek ill for him. And so even though I don't get any good out of it, Job has nothing left for me to steal or anything, well, it's just enjoyable to hurt him. Verse 14, as waters through a breach they come on me, and like a tempest they rush in on me. So he says these outcasts rushing on me are like water breaking a dam. When a dam breaches, the water rushes in. So every lowlife feels free to rush in and get his strike at me. Like a storm blowing in so rapidly, they rush to attack him. Now we can understand that Job was, before when he was powerful, he was a just man, and he was on the side of the just. And so, therefore, he would have been against these outcast fools. Those who were driven out because they were thieves and unjust, well, Job was probably fully in agreement with that. He was the one who was driving them out. Now they say, aha! Now that Job is a lowlife, now that Job has come down and has no protection, why now we can get revenge. So that's probably much of what's going on here. So in this portion, Job ignored Zophar's interruption, and he goes on to make his closing argument. He sadly remembers his past prosperity when God was on his side, when his children were alive, when he was highly respected, when he was honored for wisdom, and when he sat as king or chief. Now those whose fathers he would have despised, those who are outcast for their crimes, they look at him and mock him. They have no respect for him. They would refuse to take him in. You're an outcast even from the outcast, Job. What a fall Job had had. And remember, Satan has done all this, and he's done it not just to hurt Job, but to try to turn him against Yehovah. Well, Job was only part done. He's going to go on and describe his miserable condition and then make his final argument, his conclusion. But we will study Job's conclusion next time. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please press like below and comment. The comments help promote these videos. And until we meet again around the pages of God's book, I bid you goodbye.